A tax allocation bond at $5 million. Then in January of 2005, $1.5 million was reprioritized, leaving $3.5 million total in the budget. The reason that I go there is that back when we originally looked at the project, or back when it was originally looked at, I think the magnitude of the project was obvious, and that's why they came up with the $5 million figure. That did not include seismic at that time. In 2006, a building assessment report was commissioned and done. It was very useful, except it did not, again, include seismic. In 2007, preliminary design and seismic analysis was done. We've completed that phase of the project. Realizing that $3.5 million was not going to be enough early on in this project, we set out a priority of work. And what we wanted to do is really establish a shopping list of what we would do. So we would go through it, and we would prioritize the structural seismic through the historic codes, ADA compliance, building systems, and then functionality. And we tried to basically use that as a shopping list to go through it. That was great in theory. In practicality, it's very difficult to distinguish some of these lines, and I'll tell you why in a little bit future. We came up with 3 projects. One, to stay within the budget, the $3.5 million. That would be just seismic improvements, an elevator, and exterior ramp. We would not complete the ADA improvements at all, and that's what you would get for your money, basically. Then we went to a value engineer project at $5.7 million. That would do your seismic elements. It would complete an elevator and the 2 lifts. It would do the ADA restrooms, which would be 6 total in that facility. Very limited repair to your electrical, very limited repair to your HVAC systems. Basically, we'd be putting a Band-Aid on it to go forward. Then there's the comprehensive project, $6.7 million. It would include a seismic elevator, 2 lifts, ADA restrooms, a complete new electrical system and HVAC systems, an office reconfiguration. We would redo the windows, doors, redo finishes to the ballroom and to some of the other areas in the facility. We would include a customer service counter and also paint the inside of the facility. The project costs lay out like this. These are early estimates. Remember, we're very early in the project itself. The budget version totals at $3.5 million. You see we've done the preliminary design and the engineering administration. Throughout, those numbers stay the same. You'll see final design goes up, obviously, with the complexity of the project and the more that we do, as well as the construction contract. Change order authority is usually 10% of the construction. But realize that with a valued engineer version or a budget version, your contingency is probably going to raise a little bit on that, just because it's a little more difficult and you start running into different things and have to do that to make something else work. The construction management also goes up with the cost. So the 3 projects are at $3.5 million, $5.7 million, and then $6.7 million for the total comprehensive project. Staff is recommending the comprehensive project. The budgeted amount is $3.5 million, and the project cost is $6.7 million, leaving an unfunded amount of $3.2 million. We are recommending the comprehensive project really on 3 main points. One, that this is a valuable landmark and a valuable asset for the city. 2, that deferring maintenance is never cheaper. It's always more expensive. And right now we're seeing a construction period that is way more economical than it has been in the past. We're starting to see good bids, and we're starting to see a number of bids come in. I think you see that with the fire station that's coming up. And 3, inefficiencies in the other 2 projects, the inefficiencies in the budgeted project and the inefficiencies in the value engineer project. It doesn't make a lot of sense that we go in and we have to rip out a wall and put up sheer plywood on a wall and then not do the electrical when they're there or not do the HVAC system when they're there. We'll just have to come back and redo that again. We figure it's going to be at least a 25% increase in costs if we don't do, to redo and to finally get to the product that we want. And, and more aesthetically, if we go in and we do some of the value engineered project, we'll go into that building and we will do these repairs and these upgrades, and we'll know it's better on the inside, but nobody knows it's any better on the outside. So it really lacks those finished qualities that'll work, and it's $1 million to really get to that end product. So what are some of the possible funding sources and the RDA funding sources that we have? This is an RDA funded project. We have right now in 2001 and 2003 bond fund interest. This is money that we made off the bond fund sitting in those not being used, $3.8 million. We also have RDA capital project contingency, which council was wise enough to put a project or make a project into $4.4 million for unfunded projects that go through. I think Brian's in the audience and can talk a little bit more about what other projects that we have that would go on the project contingency. We are recommending in our council report or in our finance committee report $1 million out of the bond fund interest and $2.2 million out of the capital project contingency fund. That leaves us with total available funds of $8.2 million. The fire station we have been talking about, and we did bring to your attention, bids came in. We need $1.1 million to finish that project and to go to construction. That leaves $7.1 million for funding on it. Just a real brief summary. At this point and at this juncture in this project, we need to define the scope of it. And we need to go on track if we're going to move forward with this project. And it's early in the project, but we want to define it. We want to come to you early, and we want to tell you what's going on with it. We need to allocate additional funding to move forward with it, at least in the comprehensive project. And we need to enter into an agreement for final design. We're recommending to go with KBZ Architects. They've done a great job so far, and we'd like to continue with them. With that, I'd love to entertain any questions that you do have.
Okay, thank you, John. It's a good report. Questions, Ms. Falcone?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When I hear you say it's early in the project, I have to giggle a wee bit because when I first came on council, and that's 6.5 years ago now, we were talking about this. In fact, it was under the previous Park and Recreation Director that we were actually allocating money for this project. So it's amazing to me that it takes this long, but, you know, therein lies government. So couple of quick questions. When you said that the seismic was not factored in the beginning, I would like a little clarification on that, because it seems to me that if my memory doesn't fail me completely, we talked about seismic up front in the cost of this project. So maybe you could define what you mean by seismic not being factored in at the beginning.
Sure. Couple things first. It's early in the project of my involvement, I guess, when we started really going after it.
Mr. Scho, if you were here when I got here.
Well, I wasn't with this project, so we'll start with
No,
that.
you were doing the Granada Garage, and you rock, as I recall, yes.
So it is early in its plan stage.
Yeah.
You know, we aren't at the final design, and we haven't gone through any of that. So we're still fairly early in that. So we can still pick a direction instead of going towards the total end of the project and then going back and trying to cut, which doesn't make a lot of sense and is very difficult to do. And we spend all that extra money on design, which I think is useless. So that's what I meant by that comment. And no, it has been a long time in the making.
It's always been factored in. We always knew seismic was going to be part of this project.
Well, not really. When the study that went through the building, it was a comprehensive building assessment type of study. And so what was done was they went ahead and they looked at a lot of different items in it. They looked at a lot of different building systems, but clearly in the scope they said it's not included in our scope to do seismic. So it wasn't looked at in seismic at all.
I see.
Originally, a long time ago, the building was looked at in different pieces, and doesn't make a lot of sense seismically to look at it in different pieces.
So if I understand you correctly, you're now taking a more comprehensive look at the entire building, which was not the case in the beginning.
Right.
Okay, great.
Right.
That explains a great deal. Having taken the site visit, I noticed that the building does not breathe. It is stagnant in its interior sort of air capacity. Now, I understand you're putting in the comprehensive view, you're going to put in a ventilation system. But my question goes to the dilapidated windows, which look like those at my house. But if you do the full restoration, will you get a capacity of being able to actually have those windows functioning, which they're not right now?
Actually, in the comprehensive version, we do more than that. We get all new windows all the way throughout the building.
Which will allow for cross ventilation. The building will therefore breathe on its own.
Right, in operation, right. Very definitely, and we'll use those, and we'll figure those in as part of the HVAC system.
Yeah, okay.
I think you'll remember going down in the basement and going down and seeing those 3 huge monstrosities of ventilation systems that are down there. One works, one does not work, 2 work. Those are old, very old units, and they circulate air that is inside, and from that, and they keep reusing air that's inside. New facilities and new systems actually take into account, and more greener systems take into account and use air from the outside as part of their system.
That's good. So we could, although we're putting in a ventilation system at some cost, we could very easily not have to use it very often because of the new organic ventilation that will be accompanied by the working windows.
Right, and it'll be incredibly more efficient than what you've got there.
That's fabulous. All right. Now, you mentioned in the budgeted version we have an elevator, and in the comprehensive version you have elevators, plural. This is an ADA requirement, and so explain to me how that's going to benefit the building
Well,
and the people, the general public coming to the building.
first I have to acknowledge a typo. For elevator, there is only one elevator that's going to be installed.
Total?
In the budgeted version, there's one elevator. In the comprehensive version, there are lifts included with the elevator.
Maybe you can distinguish those for
A
people.
lift is a smaller version of an elevator, I guess. It actually is usually more open to the public. It only goes up half a story or goes up to the stage, or you saw the different configuration yesterday with the sort of 2.5 stories. Instead of putting a whole elevator in that goes all the way up, penetrates the building, and destroys the historical character of it, we can get by with a lift that would be used for 1 or 2 people to just get up to that half story, open its gates, and allow people to come
And it
out.
satisfies the ADA requirements so the general public can access all 3 stories of that building.
Absolutely.
All right. Ms. Rapp, do you have something you want to add? Just grab the mic.
Oh, sorry.
It'll be easier. Thank you. The one thing that because we had quite a bit of discussion in terms of the functionality of how the Creo Recreation Center is used. The lifts are in areas which are less used by the public. For instance, it goes from the mezzanine level up to the staff offices. So we did actually go and look at some functioning lifts in other buildings and had that discussion about weighing the cost,
Right.
the placement of the elevator if we went with the other option, and the changes that would have to take place to the building. So the lifts do meet the ADA requirement, and they are in areas less used by the public.
But it's my understanding that on the 3rd floor, or I'm sorry, on the 2nd floor, there are 3 stories. One is a basement, the main floor, and the 2nd floor. We have a rehearsal hall or a dance floor, and we're going to be adding, in the comprehensive version, an additional dance floor which can accommodate not only performances on some level, mostly rehearsal space. So
Yes.
it will be accessed by the general public.
And that floor level is on the primary elevator stop. It's just that also at that elevator stop to the second floor, you would take, if you wanted to go up to the staff offices, which is like, what,
3.5
steps? Yeah, 3.5 feet, something
Okay.
like that. Then you would take the lift up. But for the general public accessing the public rooms, it's very convenient. The elevator stops and they're right there. It's all on the same level.
Okay, my last question, Mr. Chair, has to do with the funding, and that's the additional 2.2 from the RDA Capital. That's not coming from our housing fund, is it? Or is it?
No, the 2.2 capital that is coming out of that fund is actually a project fund that you as council established, or you as the board, I should say, established, and was specifically for underfunded projects.
So we're not cutting out any possible affordable housing by appropriating this $2.2 million.
My understanding is no.
Mr. Bossy.
I couldn't have said it better myself. That's exactly true. The contingency account is specifically for RDA capital projects, and so it will not be taking any funds away from our affordable housing funding in any way, shape, or form. So.
Great, I'm very satisfied. Mr. Chair, thank you very much.
Okay, Ms. Snyder?
Thanks. Just to follow up on that last point, there was another $2 million we did take from the capital side over to the affordable housing side at that big meeting in this room 3 years ago, and that's a separate fund altogether than this contingency fund you're talking about, correct? Yeah.
That is correct.
Okay. A couple of questions. One having to do with the historical component to it. And actually, for the record, although I couldn't make the public meeting yesterday, I did take a tour on Friday morning. So I did get to see the inside of the building, and Mr. Schoaf gave me a good tour. So I did see all the nooks and crannies, and there's a lot of them. But in terms of the restoration of the inside, in terms of the painting and the fireplaces, and could you just expand a little bit more with the comprehensive plan about restoring that historical nature of the building?
In the comprehensive version, we go ahead and try and bring the building back and pay attention to its details that we have. In the other versions, what you'll see is basically you won't see a lot, because what we end up doing is just putting in sort of the bones and the meat of the facility and fixing those up, and then we leave what was literally the project's main driving force alone way back then, and that's the painting and the deteriorated some of the deteriorated wood that is either gone eaten by termites or by rot. We leave that sections alone just to try and get in the like I said, the priority functions, the structural, then the ADA requirements, and then the building system requirements.
Okay.
So with that, the difference is that we pay attention to some of the those finite elements or those fine elements of the building.
Right.
I could also tell the committee that we could spend $11 or $12 million there paying attention to all of the detail
Right.
and all of the fixtures and restoring this building into what was once its first element. We're not doing that. It's not a project that is over glamorous.
Right.
It is a project that
But in
is-
terms of repainting, and I know we talked about the fireplaces there, those aren't going away just by fixing the seismic upgrade and code upgrades. There's actually the main components, and if in the future we wanted to put embellishments behind, and bring it back to its former glory, we can. But this is more bricks, the literal bricks and mortar of the project of making it sound.
We did have an opportunity to take the conceptual to HLC, and although their purview is not inside a building, we did open it up to the inside because we thought it was a structure that merited HLC looking at the inside.
Great.
And one of their items were the fireplaces, and we are going to end up keeping the fireplaces and structurally making those fireplaces strong and sturdy and not collapsing, in the case of an earthquake.
Great.
So in that element, we did open it up.
I appreciate that. And then, okay, go ahead.
I wanted to just add, because one of the elements of our discussion as we faced all these challenges as staff, and I would just like to share this piece with you. When this building is down for construction, there will be no public access, most likely. The project will make sense to do it all at one time. This is a heavily used community facility. And similar to the decision to close Los Baños and do the leaking wall repair and do the replastering, because both involve emptying the water out of the pool for a period of time, I think with this project, it's the same thing. And if we're going to restrict public access for a period of time, it makes sense to do as much as you can during that time. And also, we really talked about, from a community perspective, it was very hard for us to just go in and know that we were going to deny access for the period of construction, and then when people went back into the building, it was going to look like it did before. And that was very, very difficult for us. So I just, from a user perspective, those were some things that we talked about, because we know we'll hear it from our users.
I appreciate it. And then my last line of questioning about green building design, and we talked also about this on Friday, but I know by the HVAC system and having better windows and reusing the building, I mean, those are all components to go towards an existing building, green building design. It's much harder, I know, to restore building and make it a LEED qualified, although it's possible with a lot more added bells and whistles. But we're just talking, again, more structural. But in the future, if there was potential, for example, for solar panels or other things like that, that is something, again, we could look at as a way to offset the energy use of the building. And can you talk about that a little bit?
In the comprehensive version, we are looking at, let's put it this way. In the comprehensive version, we have a chance at achieving a silver LEED remodel or NC building. In either of the budget or the value engineered versions, we have no chance whatsoever. This is not going to be a very easy building to get to a silver LEED renovation building at all. We're going to scrape by and maybe get there. But everything we do that we are taking, into account, trying to be more green with it. We're also studying right now an opportunity that we could use the existing gym roof, which is closed right now to the basketball courts, as a solar addition and putting solar panels there and using that electricity to run back into this building. We will have an alternate put in case we have enough available funds to cover it to actually do that project.
Great, thank you.
I have a question on funding. Maybe we can go back to Brian. Can you put the bond funding up again? Slide.
Yeah, we can hit the previous. Well,
The 2001-2003 bond interest, the 3.8, that earlier in the year, and then again as we get into budget time, we're going to be looking at total RDA funding available to the city for all the different RDA projects. That's true, right?
We'd be happy to do that. Yeah, when we get more involved in the budget presentation, yes.
This amount here is essentially accrued interest. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Horton, it's accrued and interest that is projected to be earned
right
during the next fiscal year as well.
So
it's not all money in the bank.
I understand that.
Okay.
So if we look at a comprehensive list of RDA potential projects in the future, that's a fund source presumably that would be open to us, right?
Mr. Chair, yes. I mean, that's going to be available with any other funding sources such as tax increment and the like.
Right. Well, I'm just trying to understand that by taking money out of here, it's money that wouldn't be available for some other RDA project.
That's absolutely correct.
So we just need to be aware of that.
Yeah.
And then the second question is back over to John Shoup. In essentially version 1 versus version 3, can we talk about that for a second?
sure.
Okay, so version 1 takes care of all the life safety issues, faulty wiring, earthquake, as does version 3?
No.
Okay, explain to that a little bit.
The budgeted version, or the budget version within budget, takes care of your seismic for meeting historic codes, which means it's 75% of 1995 codes. So we're talking about basically getting out of the building. Seismic, it does put in an elevator, and really that's about it. In the valued engineered version, there was some minor electrical, only dealing with the elevator work. So we don't really do a lot of work on the elevator,
So-
on the electrical.
So the choice really, the valued engineer doesn't really add much. It's really for us between 1 and 3 rather than 1 and 2. Is that?
Well, the value engineer does do some of the more of the electrical that does help it meet life safety issues going through. So it, in that respect, it does. I thought the question was from the budget version, which was just the elevators really and the seismic, or just the elevator and the seismic, versus the comprehensive budget. I thought that was the question. your
Well,
original
what I'm trying to get a handle on is, as far as life safety issues, ADA, et cetera, version 1 does not cover all of that.
Correct.
Okay, done.
The value engineered version, which is version 2, does.
Okay, good enough. All right. Anyone have further questions?
I do, actually.
Okay, Ms. O'Connor?
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. Ms. Rapp, you talked about the building being down, and I was wondering, just for public consumption, really, how long do you anticipate it being closed? And I assume when you say it's being closed, there is no relocation of the uses to any other facility. Ms. Rapp, or Mr. Schoaf?
Maybe I could start off on that question,
That's
then
fine.
we could turn it over to Nancy. The building on a comprehensive version would probably be down 9 months. However, the entire building will not be down the entire 9 months.
Good.
What we
Can
would-
you go into that just a wee bit?
Yeah, what we would tend to do is work some phasing options as we develop the final plans and specifications. One such phasing option would probably be opening the ballroom early, because we could actually do that section first, open that section up, and then we would have the upstairs and the downstairs area of the main facility, and the 2 or 3
So if I understand you, all the dancing facility, or the main dancing facility would be down for a bit and then up at the very first chance, and the staff offices would be the ones that would be mostly impacted for the duration.
the staff offices and the
Upstairs rehearsal hall.
rehearsal rooms, and there's a downstairs rehearsal room
So all
too.
those people who enjoy
also
that wonderful bouncy floor that we all bounced on yesterday would be inconvenienced and out of their recreational activity for a few months, and then back up.
Yes, probably a little more than a few months.
Well,
and I don't wanna
tell
make any
us how
promises.
long you think. Maybe 4 or 5?
We would probably be in that range.
Okay.
More.
But you're going to try to open that at first chance.
Yes, there's limited work that needs to be done in there.
Okay.
And it's always a balancing act between cost and moving in quickly.
Sure.
So we want to make sure that we weigh that consideration.
Now, along with that same theme, you said the basketball courts on the roof were closed, but you didn't say at the moment. It's my understanding that they are closed permanently pursuant to fire code regulations.
That's very correct.
They will never reopen.
Right.
Therefore, we are looking to have the best and highest use of that roof, which may in the future be solar panels.
Right.
It will never be a basketball court again,
Yes, the basketball
unless
courts.
we do, $4 or $5 million worth of work or something.
Well, the basketball courts are limited, are restricted use, which is absolutely no use except for maintenance,
There you go.
because of the exiting requirements that are
You
necessary.
have to build a secondary stairway
We have to build, yes, a second and a third
and an
stairway.
elevator and various other things pursuant to fire code.
Right.
This is
Right
not
now,
because we don't like basketball on the
right.
roof.
Right now, if you were to
Just
use
to be
that
clear.
at all, we would have to put in an alternative exit to get down.
Right.
Because right now it is considered unsafe because if there were a fire in the building, there would be no way to evacuate the people up top like they should.
And my last point, Mr. Chair, before I'm willing to make a motion to forward both A and B recommendations of staff, is that in order to do a restoration on the inside with respect to all the beautiful historic painting and the floral accents and all the various different historic accoutrements that exist in that building, it would take an effort by the Friends of the Korea Rec Center.
To get it to a pristine,
Like the Granada.
historic, yes. A
So we're not
pristine
doing
historic-
that.
We're not doing
We're
that.
doing all the inside stuff, and if people want to see the inside restored, we're going to have to do a nonprofit kind of a restoration.
Yes, but I should say that the comprehensive version does not destroy anything.
No,
It is
absolutely
historic.
not. But it's not going to change the look and make it beautiful gilded floral
Gold
accents.
leaf or anything else like that.
No.
So,
All
yes.
right. Well,
Okay.
at any point, I'm willing to recommend we forward both A and B.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries.
I
Thank
just
you.
want to just add that it is a beautiful building and a historic one, and we should just do it right. So that's, if it takes an extra $1 million to go to the comprehensive version, that's really what makes sense. And thanks.
Okay, we started with item 2 on the agenda today, and so we'll now begin with item 1, which is subject acquisition loan to City's Housing Authority for 512 to 518 Bath Street. We're having a change of personnel here, and one of you gentlemen will be presenting the case. Mr. Kiefer, over to you.
There we go. Now I'm on. I'm here to recommend that the Finance Committee recommend to the agency board approval of a $4.8 million loan to the Housing Authority for acquisition of a site located at 512, 518 Bath Street. This is a site suitable for land banking for future development. It's a large site. It's 1.1 acres on Bath near West Haley, and on it currently sit 4 small dilapidated houses towards the front of the property. And then towards the rear, there's a 10-unit apartment building and a related carport and a swimming pool. And then right behind that is Mission Creek. In fact, the apartment building and the swimming pool encroach into the 25-foot creek setback. The Housing Authority would eventually remove all the structures and develop new housing for the chronic homeless and downtown workers. We have some questions about the property's rear boundaries. It's right now based on a 1928 survey that doesn't reflect any of the changes in topography due to creek erosion or accretion. So the Housing Authority has ordered an ALTA title policy, so there will be a brand new survey. So all that will get straightened out in the back. The price of the property is $4.8 million, and we had the Housing Authority did an appraisal in December 2007. That was done at $4.6 million was the appraised value. The sellers came back then a month later with a review appraisal that said that the value was $5.5 million. And so from there they negotiated a $4.8 million price, which we found to be reasonable and fair. I say it's a large site. It's 47,485 square feet. It's in an R3 zone, so the base density would be then 29 studio units as of right development. We would expect the Housing Authority to then make a request for a significant density bonus. So we're looking perhaps in the neighborhood of 50 small units, which would be at a density that would be comparable to Casa de los Fuentes. The Housing Authority is looking to do a mix of housing for downtown workers and chronic homeless. So some of these units would then count under the 10-year plan to end chronic homeless. The Housing Authority would be looking to build towards the front of the parcel, away from the rear, so that we could accommodate a generous creek setback. The proposed agency loan would be appropriate for a land banking situation. The first 3 years would be no interest, a deferred loan, and then we would expect then in the fourth year that it would convert to a standard loan, one of our standard loans, which would be a 30-year, 3% interest, residual receipts. But if we weren't satisfied with progress that had been made at that point in the fourth year, the loan would automatically convert to a fully amortized 3% 10-year term loan. The Housing Authority may be back to ask for additional funds for construction. It all depends on the type of development they come up with and the funding sources that they're able to reach. Say they were to come back for an additional $1 million in assistance from us for construction, that would be a total subsidy then of $5.8 million for 50 units. That would translate to be $116,000 per unit, which is pretty consistent with what we're doing these days on other projects. We have sufficient housing funds for this. We've got about $8 million combined in both RDA housing and home funds. That would cover this acquisition plus what we're planning to do soon with Transition House on their mom's property. And then by the time we're going to need to give a little bit more money to the Housing Authority for Hagen property, we'd have another $3.2 million in RDA funds. So we'd have enough money for everything that's on our plate. That's it for my presentation.
Yeah, I had a question. I see Mr. Pearson here. I was just interested in having a little more clarification on comparable values. There is I think one comparable listed, and I know the market's a bit fluid at this point. So do we have a little bit more data on that?
Yes, Chair Horton, members of the committee, Rob Pearson from the Housing Authority. The appraisal that we had commissioned in September gave us a number of comparable sales. I think the one that is perhaps most telling is the one just a block up at 622 Bath Street. It's Castellina Court. It's been in and out of escrow. I can tell you it hasn't closed, but it's been in escrow for some time at $116 a square foot. So that's very favorable. And the one that did close in September of last year was a property on Upper De La Vina that is comparable in terms of zoning. It's about a little over a half acre in size, but it sold for $121 a square foot. And I think that does reflect a slightly better neighborhood. But the zoning is comparable and size is comparable.
Yeah, this is all pure land value, correct?
Yeah, and that was reflected on those other two sales as well. The Castellina Court potential purchasers are looking to clear that property, but I think they're having second thoughts because it's a nice bungalow court, and that might pose some problems for them.
In our case, we would retain the apartment for a while.
We would retain the apartment for a while. It's habitable. We'll clean it up a little bit, but it's really in a bad location. We think the property presents an excellent redevelopment opportunity, and since we're looking to redevelopment funds, this would be a great acquisition, good size. And
so in order to fully utilize the property, you would have to go through the planning process, propose a project, and do all the environmental reviews and things like that. Yeah, okay. Committee questions? Ms. Schneider?
Thanks. The home funds that are available for this, and if this was just a downtown worker project, could we use home funds for that, or is it also because we're looking at lower income or chronically homeless component to it? Because I know home funds have different criteria in terms of what you can use those kind of funds for. Is that, or does it make any difference in this kind of?
In this case, we would prefer to use agency funds. If we were to use home funds or federal funds, we've got all kinds of floodplain issues in that area, and the feds are really hard when we try to do that.
Okay, because
So
you said there are
we're
$8 million combined in RDA and home funds, but you were talking about all the different things coming up in,
Yes,
in not
yes.
just this particular project, the
That's
mom's
correct.
property, the Hagen property, this one.
That's
Okay,
correct.
so for this particular property, we're just looking
We're
at
just looking
RDA funds.
agency
All right,
funds.
just to be clear on that. Could you, Rob, could you go over the tenant relocation process of what you have in mind? I mean, you have tenants in there now. Are there any Section 8, any of your clients or residents there now, and would they be eligible in a new project, and what would a tenant relocation be? I guess there's our ordinance, but what your thoughts are on that?
We have given all of the tenants in the 10-unit apartment building what we call a notice of non-displacement, and also advising them at the time that we would pursue with developing our property, we would give them relocation benefits in accordance with California law. Because we're a public agency, just like the redevelopment agency, we have to follow the same relocation ordinance. With respect to the 4 older homes, prior to our negotiations on this property, the city had they'd actually yellow tagged the old houses, and the current owners are giving them benefits under the current city's tenant displacement ordinance, which my review shows that they are superior benefits to what they would get under California relocation law. So they are being dealt with. They are happy. They received a letter from us too, notifying of us our pending acquisition and our willingness to work with them should there be any problems whatsoever.
And all the tenants there currently are market rate rental tenants, so they're not subsidized housing in any way?
I believe we have 2 Section 8s in there,
okay.
And the rest of the tenants, based on the condition of the property and initial survey that we've done of the tenant households, we believe they're all low income, meaning they're below 80% of area median. So we may be able to slot them into some of our housing programs and assist them that way, if not pay them their relocation benefits pursuant to California law.
Okay. And then the creek, being that this is Lower Mission Creek right here in this room on Friday, we had our, I guess, semi-annual update and all the different projects associated with Lower Mission Creek. This seems to me a prime opportunity for us to look at this portion of the creek in terms of its restoration, of perhaps, being able to use native plantings to have the new building set back farther away from the creek, a great public outreach piece with the new tenants there. I don't know if you've talked about that much or if that's something that you can look to. And I mean, the funding for purchasing this needs to be RDA, but in the future when we get to creek restoration and something, I guess we may want to look into potential other sources through flood control or whatever for that Lower Mission Creek restoration piece of it.
We concur.
Okay, good.
We agree this is a great opportunity for this, and we've discussed this preliminarily with Rob. And as I mentioned in the report, we do look to have an increased setback there, and then whatever we want to do as far as creek restoration, that would be a possibility as well.
Okay. Well, I would just encourage you to work with our Creeks division and on that piece of it as the project moves forward with.
Yeah, I would comment that I think this kind of full redevelopment approach to the property is what we're interested in. I think the benefit of assisting us with this purchase is that we would be very favorable to provide the city with whatever easement it wanted at no cost to try to facilitate whatever Mission Creek improvements you want to make as the city government.
Great. Thank you.
Ms. Falcone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Building on that, first of all, I'm without question in favor of land banking this property, and to help with adding to our either low-income downtown worker or even SRO population is not an argument you're going to get from me. So with that being said, when you said generous setback from the creek, little red flag sort of went up in my funny little head and said, well, what does that mean, generous, And you just said whatever we want. I would caution you not to use those phrases. However, I was going to ask, how does this fit in with the Lower Mission Creek restoration that we are fully under steam with undertaking with a lot of different partners? This is just below where we're going to be doing, or just above? It's not exactly in the corridor. Is it smack in the corridor? All right. Well, then we have a lot of partners that are going to be brought to bear on this piece. I wasn't sure. I thought maybe it was just below the restoration piece that we're trying to do. But if it's smack in the middle, then this is a no-brainer. It's going to be a part of the restoration of this portion of the creek. Is going to be a part of that entire Mission Creek. Lower Mission Creek restoration that we're undergoing as we speak. Mr. Pearson.
I would add that a couple of developers, Mr. Bill Wagner and Frank Thompson, were pursuing this property over the last 2.5 years, and they've run some additional design scenarios that we're building off of. They were looking to do it on a leasehold basis and The lease was going to base on a value of $6 million, so I think what we're purchasing it at is much more favorable. They would have come to the city for affordable housing dollars to do a project. So we've done some preliminary, or borrowing on their preliminary design element. We figure a 50-foot setback is easy. We might even be able to make it greater and put the whole building forward on the property. No, we think we can get very creative, and it's better for us from a design standpoint to have the building near the frontage, and it's a very deep parcel. So
I appreciate that. When I say careful, it's not because I don't want the most creek setback and the best habitat restoration that we can get, but on the flip side of that, my next question goes to neighborhood compatibility. And I know that there have been a number of parcels, especially on Haley, that are all deep parcels, that have been redeveloped, if you will, by private owners over the last 10 years. I want to ask you how your vision for this property is going to fit into that very dense neighborhood, but ostensibly it's still looks like a single-family neighborhood, although I know it's multifamily. So how do you address the street frontage with that sort of density?
I think because of its location, and if you look at our success with the Casa de las Fuentes design and the El Carrillo design, which are at densities equal, if not higher, you'll see that our ability to develop a lot smaller units than what a private developer would typically approach to sustain it in the marketplace will do fine. And if you remember, what's directly across the street is the athletic club and the large law office building. And then just down across Haley is the building where Lenvik and Minor is. So you've got some rather big structures, and the structure right to the south of us is a daycare center, which is not particularly attractive. It's just a box. So I think the surrounding uses we can blend.
But between Bath and the freeway, you see an awful lot of old single-family structures as well, although there's a lot of multifamily going on in the back of those structures. I guess my point is, when people hear 50 units, the hair on the back of their neck stands up. And so I guess what I'm asking you is to give people a little bit of a comfort level that it's not necessarily something they need to be afraid of, that we will still preserve the neighborhood while going forward with some fairly high density, hopefully.
I think if they look to Casa de las Fuentes and El Carrillo, those are improvements to the neighborhood, and we would handle this one in the same kind of tasteful, compatible way.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Further questions?
No, I'm just happy
Ready to make a motion, Ms. Snyder?
I'll happily make a motion to for staff recommendation of $4.8 million loan of RDA funds for this project.
Your second?
and appropriate to take those from unappropriated reserves from the RDA Housing Fund. Second.
Okay, a motion is second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion
Thank you
carries.
very much.
Thank you. All right.
Finance Committee, we spend money.
Moving on to item 3 in our agenda, which is review of the recommended budget for fiscal year 2009. I think we're back to Mr. Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Bob Pearson, Finance Director, and yes, here we go again. This really, by several hours, is the official kickoff to the city's public review budget season. As you know, we are revisiting the second year of our 2-year financial plan, which was adopted last June of 07, for fiscal years 2008, which is the current fiscal year, and the fiscal year beginning this coming July 1, which is fiscal year 2009. And as you know, tonight at this evening's council session, we will be formally kicking that off in front of the full council with a presentation and filing of the budget document and approval of the public hearing and budget review schedules. So today what we'd like to do, as we have done with the committee in the past, is start the process of setting the Finance Committee's review schedule for the budget items. And what we have given you in the agenda report is a list of 5 items. Really, the first 3 of which, and I'll enumerate them momentarily, are really standard items that we bring to the Finance Committee every budget season, and those are a review of the general fund revenue projections and assumptions, Secondly, a detailed review of the general fund's multi-year forecast and the projections out over the next several years. And then third, this year, a review in detail of the general fund's balancing strategy and the adjustments that staff is proposing. Staff is proposing the adjustments in order to maintain a balanced budget for the general fund. And then two other items that we thought staff is recommending that the committee take some time to look at this year. The first of which is a review of the community development fees and revenues, the departmental revenues from community development. And secondly, as we did last year, a joint review with Parks and Recreation and the Police Department on an update on our youth programs. So those are the 5 items that we are recommending that the committee review, and what we are here for today, besides to ask you if that is okay with you, is to further ask you if there are any additional items that the committee would like staff to bring for the committee's review. If there are, or whether there are or there aren't, what we will do is we will return to you next week with a schedule. We didn't want to put a schedule together until we saw the scope of what it is the committee wants to consider. But we would take these 5 items, assuming that these are acceptable to you for bringing to you for review through the budget process, and add to it anything that you might want to see added, and then bring it back to you next week with a schedule attached for your review. Obviously, depending on the length of the number of items that would end up on the list, will determine what kind of meeting schedule we'll need. So that's why we haven't brought you a schedule today, because we thought it would be better to sort of work the list up first. So that's really...
Okay, I have a question, and Mr. Casey's in the audience, so maybe it will help to have him here. Certainly it's a time for the city to be concerned about traffic and circulation issues and transportation and things like that. Is that a topic that will be covered in the course of our general review as we talk about these kind of issues, or is it something that we need to call out separately?
Well, I'll start, and then if Mr. Casey wants to add anything, of course, he's welcome to. But as part of the budget review process before the full council, each and every one of the city's departments will be making presentations to the council on their budgets and all of the components of that budget. And so I would assume that, well, I don't have to assume, I know that Streets Fund, being part of the Public Works Department, will indeed be part of the Public Works Department's presentation. But if the committee wanted more detail, then that's something we would bring directly to the committee.
Mr. Casey?
Chair Horton and committee members. 2 things. One, on this afternoon's council agenda item, you'll be hearing a presentation on our Measure D 2-year allocation plan, and that will bring you up to speed on how we would propose to prepare the plan that we have to submit to SBCAG for the final 2 years of Measure D. And so you'll get a thorough presentation in that regard. And then on May 7th, when we make our department presentation to you as well, we'll talk about the implications of Measure A and how that would look from a long-term perspective if it passes or not passes, as well as the utility users tax and the potential impact that could have on street funding as well. So those are 2 kind of upcoming opportunities we'll be talking about. Happy to go into more detail at Finance Committee, or if that suffices.
Okay. Shall we move on to committee then? Ms. Marconi?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Building on that, don't go anywhere. I had the same thought. It's a little broader than that. It's beyond. It definitely has to do with Measure DA, whatever you want to call it, Measure A, as we're calling it, which is the reinstitution of the half-cent sales tax for streets, maintenance, and transportation projects, which we need desperately. It also has to do with the upcoming reconfiguration, if you will, of the user utility tax on telecommunications, which we are hoping the voters will continue, that half of which we currently allocate to streets and currently goes to the general fund, which we will explain further in the future. But it also goes to an upcoming conversation that the council may or may not involve itself in, and that has to do with the homeless shelter, the homeless population, the aggressive panhandling on State Street, how it's affecting businesses on State Street and at the beach, and the entire infrastructure conversation. And I'm wondering whether or not it might be better to bring that here to the Finance Committee so that we can dissect a few portions of this and maybe have some in-depth conversations about the public infrastructure and the funding of the public infrastructure and the impacts that certain entities have, be it business or be it folks who frequent the downtown area for one purpose or another. Be they you or I, or be they, others. I think I'd like to see that at Finance Committee, actually. The other piece of that has to do with the other component of public safety, which is fire, which are our first responders, and have everything to do with what happens with some of the populations that we're going to be discussing. And I think I would like to see both those conversations happen at the Finance Committee, in addition to the police and park and recreation. We have a couple of things going on here, one being youth, one being not so young, and one being, how we sustain ourselves through bringing people to this location in the form of tourism. So, Mr. Casey, if you could give me your thoughts on that.
We're happy to come and talk about anything. If I could ask you just to clarify a little bit more about what you meant by the conversation you'd like to see happen here. I heard infrastructure, which my public works hat makes me think of something, but you talked more about kind of downtown and the issues of homelessness and public safety.
Well,
in
it's
that
beyond
regard.
downtown.
So if you could,
It's how our infrastructure coincides or interfaces with the various different populations that we're discussing, be it tourism or homelessness or youth, and our local residents. And I think that there is a broader conversation about how we do transportation, how we do circulation, how police and fire respond. I just think it all goes together, and I think that having that comprehensive conversation and the dollars that are currently allocated in the various different areas is useful as a global discussion, as opposed to having it segmented. Now, I know it takes more time, and it's more work for all of us, especially you. But I think it behooves us to look at it in a global and a comprehensive sense.
The reason that I raised that question with you was similar. I'm interested in the streets program, but that isn't really what I was trying to get at. Coming from a spot on the Transportation Circulation Committee, I was more interested in the overall planning elements of it, and how all of the elements of the whole city fit together and work. And is this something that we're going to be addressing in the budget process? I understand Measure A, D, but it just seemed like even recently we went off and studied Upper State Street traffic flows, and things like that are important to the community. So if there's a way that we can talk about that a little bit, I think I would be supportive of that. And I also agree with the public safety as an area. Ms. Schneider?
Thank you. Well, I was thinking of similar things, especially to me, there are three components here in terms of how we do our budget. There's what we can control in our own budget and how we allocate the funds that we have. There are two things coming up that are going to be on some ballot, Measure A and potentially we haven't voted on it, but the UUT, and that's up to the voters whether or not that moves forward or not. And then there are other governmental agencies who have to make their decisions, the school district being one with the cuts that they have to grapple with, the county being another significant one, and the decisions that they make in order to make their balanced budgets work, how that may impact us in terms of whether it's different recreational programs for youth that were once funded by the school district that are no longer going to be. We did some of that last year, but there might be a concern this year. Whether that means cuts in mental health programs, and what does that mean in terms of people on our streets and the waterfront, and how that relates to our public safety and preventative programs. So I don't know if that fits in the multi-year projections piece of it, because we won't know some of those answers until we hear from the school district and the county with their, and we're all working on parallel tracks here in terms of our own budget process. But perhaps, I mean, maybe as part of the Parks and Recreation, Police Department, youth programs is what we're currently doing, and then how that relates to what may or may not occur in other agencies and how we're going to address that. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is looking at the multi-year projections of what if Measure A goes away, or what if the telecommunications piece goes away? How much money are we really talking about, and what capacity in terms of that gap? So we can really put a number on the potential impact to our own budget. And then the issue, as was just talked about homelessness, I think a lot of that's going to have to deal with what we're currently seeing now in terms of funding for our restorative policing program, for example, the downtown bike patrols that we've reinstituted on the west side and east side, but then also what else is happening or potentially happening with the safety net type programs that we don't have jurisdiction over. The county does and we don't, and if there are changes, how that's going to impact us.
Ms. Pearson, you want to take a crack?
I will. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councilmember Schneider, a couple things. One is, I agree, on the ballot measures, we're not going to know about those till November, long after we've adopted our budget. But I also think that it's fair to say that staff will be certainly prepared to discuss, as part of this budget process, what would be the potential impacts of losing one or both of those critical funding sources. So that part's easy. I think some of the other pieces are a little more difficult, and you mentioned timing. The problem is that the one thing that nobody mentioned in the discussion up until now is the state. And when you talk about the impact on the county and the school districts, really what you're talking about is, what is the state going to do to them? And as we all know, the state has not been a model of efficiency when it comes to adopting their budgets on time. And given the duress on the state fiscal situation this year, I personally don't expect the state to be adopting their budget by the constitutional deadline in June. So I don't think we're going to really, besides we know it's bad, and specifically what those impacts are going to be, we don't know yet. And the fact is that there are some impacts that you mentioned, sort of indirect impacts of how impacts on the county or the school district might impact things we do with them or jointly with them, or things that we might have to pick up because they're not, or what they stop doing has impacts on us. For instance, less spending on social services, mental health has impacts on our public safety.
Correct. And our calls.
But they're also direct. Excuse me, I'm sorry, but
okay.
Just to get it out, there are also very real possibilities of direct impacts on us from the state budget. They've already talking about the Proposition 172, the half-cent public safety sales tax, booking fees, the Cops Ahead program, most of which are public safety related. And so, and all of this, and again, I don't want to get into the discussion that preempt tonight, but all of this in an environment where we're going to be, how shall I say it, euphemistically, resource challenged ourselves,
sure,
just because of our local situation.
Right.
And so we're going to have a lot of priorities and a lot of, I believe, tough decisions to make.
So I agree that these bigger global, holistic, whatever you want to call it, conversations as part of the budget process needs to happen as much as we know the information. I also think that we're probably going to need to have that kind of information July, August, September, after we know more what's happened with the state and the county and the school district after they finalize their budgets, and maybe come back and say, okay, now what? How is that going to impact us? And not that we're going to change the budget as soon as we adopt one, but just to look forward about what that could mean for us. But so it sounds like there's like a part one and a part two, part of this bigger picture conversation that I think should happen at the Finance Committee. I agree with that.
Okay, Snyder, do you have Falcone, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on that, in fact, tomorrow I take an 8 a.m. flight up to Sacramento to engage in legislative action days and a board of directors meeting at the League of California Cities, where I'm sure the state budget is going to be first and foremost on the list of topics for conversation and lobbying at the Capitol to make sure that the city's budgets remain intact. So I'll be up there for the next 3 days doing that with the other 478 city representatives that make up the league. I think that we're going to know, hopefully we're going to know a lot more by the May revise, which is when the governor actually comes out with his, fish or cut bait budget, if you will. And so I'm hoping that we'll know sooner than later. Of course, we're not going to know anything until everything is T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. But I think we might be able to go forward, and I'm glad to hear consensus on this committee that we should have a more comprehensive view and do a lot of, well, what if this and what if that, and what does that really mean in terms of the kind of services that we can provide. And it really does have to do with the three main topics that are the city's function. That's public safety, police and fire, and public infrastructure, which primarily has to do with roads, and in our case, water and sewer. So to have those topics at the Finance Committee, we can really look over the budget and really decide, as opposed to piecemealing it, and we'd all like to throw a ton of money at youth programs. I'd like to carve out $1 million from the UUT and throw that directly at youth programs, but we can't do that. So I think we need to have that conversation here. Now, hopefully we'll know sooner rather than later, and I'll let you know what I find out when I come back, although you all have your own sources that are far better than mine.
My experience with the May revise at the University of California was that it just was the beginning of the fight. So I hope you're right. In any way, Mr. Pearson, you've heard us. You need a clarifying motion, or what are you looking for at this point?
No, we do not need a motion. I think we will take your input and bring to you next week a schedule with topics on it for your review and revision and approval.
Okay, excellent. Do you have further topics for today?
I do not.
Does anyone have any further items of discussion? If not, then we'll adjourn this meeting.